I had been camping alone for a couple of days in a remote area, miles away from the nearest town. The forecast had called for some rain, but nothing that seemed worth worrying about. I had checked the sky earlier in the evening, and while the clouds had thickened, there was no immediate sign of trouble. The air had been calm, and the forest around me had settled into that quiet stillness that comes just before nightfall. By the time it was fully dark, I was inside my tent, lying on my sleeping bag, listening to the distant rumble of thunder. It was soft at first, just a low growl on the horizon, but as the minutes passed, it grew stronger. The wind picked up, rattling the fabric of my tent. I zipped up my sleeping bag a little tighter, trying to convince myself that it was just a passing storm, nothing more. Then the rain came. It started as a light drizzle, a soft tapping against the nylon of my tent, but it didn't stay that way for long. Within minutes, the drops became heavier, louder, hitting with a force that made it sound like the tent was being pelted with pebbles. The wind howled through the trees, bending them, making them creak and groan under the strain. I could hear branches snapping somewhere in the distance. The thunder, once far away, was now overhead, shaking the ground with each strike. I stayed inside, gripping my flashlight, feeling the air grow heavy with static. The flashes of lightning outside were coming more frequently now, almost strobe-like, illuminating the inside of my tent in rapid bursts. Every few seconds, the entire forest was lit up in a ghostly white, revealing trees bending under the force of the wind, the rain coming down in sheets. I tried to focus on my breathing, keeping it steady, telling myself that I had weathered storms before, that it would pass soon. Then I heard the roar. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before. A deep, monstrous sound, low at first, but quickly growing into a deafening, all-encompassing roar. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't thunder. It was something else. The kind of sound that makes your body react before your mind even fully understands what's happening. Tornado. I knew I had no real shelter. No car, no solid structure. My only option was to ride it out. My hands shook as I scrambled to reinforce my tent as best I could, pushing my gear against the sides, making sure nothing was loose. But I knew it was pointless. If the tornado came straight for me, there was nothing I could do. No amount of preparation would stop my tent from being ripped apart like paper. The wind hit harder, a brutal force that made the walls of my tent bow inward. The lightning was almost constant now, illuminating everything in eerie flashes. The trees outside swayed wildly, their tops disappearing into the darkness as they bent under the strain. The rain was no longer falling straight down. It was being driven sideways, a solid sheet of water that made it impossible to see anything beyond a few feet. I pressed myself as low as I could, covering my head with my arms, every muscle in my body tense. The roar grew louder, an unnatural, gut-wrenching sound that drowned out everything else. The ground vibrated beneath me, the air thick with pressure, making my ears pop. For a split second, I thought the tornado was coming directly for me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the roar began to fade. The wind was still howling, the rain still hammering down, but the overwhelming force of the tornado was moving away. It had passed, not over me, but close enough that I had felt the edge of its power. My entire body was shaking, my breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. My tent was still standing, somehow, though it had nearly collapsed under the force of the wind. The poles were bent, the fabric stretched and soaked through, but it had held together. I didn't sleep that night. The storm continued for hours, though it was nothing compared to the sheer terror of that tornado's roar. I stayed curled up, listening, waiting, every nerve in my body still on high alert. When dawn finally broke, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, the wind reduced to a steady breeze. I forced myself to step outside, my legs weak and unsteady. The campsite was a disaster. My gear was scattered, the trees around me stripped of branches, leaves, even bark in some places. The ground was littered with debris. I followed the destruction outward, walking toward where I thought the tornado had passed. A few kilometers away, the landscape had changed completely. Trees had been snapped in half, some uprooted entirely. A wide, unmistakable path had been cut straight through the forest, a raw scar left behind by the storm's fury. It was humbling to see. I had been so close, so incredibly close, to being caught in its direct path. If it had shifted just a little more in my direction, I wouldn't be standing here. I packed up quickly. The thought of spending another night in that forest, after what had happened, was too much. The walk back to my car felt longer than before, every step heavy with exhaustion, but also relief. I had made it through. Somehow I had made it through. Even now, I can still hear it. That deep, inescapable roar. It's not like thunder, not like wind. It's something else entirely. Something raw and powerful. Something that reminds you just how small you really are. I don't camp in that area anymore. I doubt I ever will. Some sounds never leave you, and that roar is one of them. It was deep into the night, around 2 a.m., and the only light came from the faint embers of our dying fire. The glow barely reached beyond the immediate area of our camp, leaving the surrounding forest in an oppressive blackness. It was the kind of dark that made you feel trapped, like the trees were closing in around you. The air was still, thick with the scent of burnt wood and damp earth, and every little sound carried, making it impossible to ignore. We had been camping in a secluded area, far from any towns or roads, a place chosen specifically for its isolation. The trip had been planned for months, a chance to escape from the distractions of daily life. But as the night stretched on, that same isolation that had seemed so inviting now felt suffocating. The fire had burned down to a low smolder, its warmth barely noticeable against the creeping chill of the night air. The only real source of heat was the occasional crackling of the remaining logs, sending up tiny sparks that flickered and died in the darkness. Then we heard it rustling from the trees just beyond the reach of our light. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable over the soft crackling of the fire. But then it grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't the kind of sound made by the wind. This was something moving, something alive. It stopped and started again, as if whatever was out there was creeping closer, testing the boundaries of our campsite. A wave of unease settled over us. Our flashlights flicked on almost simultaneously, the beams cutting through the darkness in search of the source of the sound. The forest was still. The rustling had stopped the moment the lights came on, and we scanned the underbrush, the twisted trunks of the trees, the low-hanging branches that swayed ever so slightly. But there was nothing, no movement, no sign of anything watching us. The silence stretched on, growing heavier with each passing second. Then, without warning, something darted from the underbrush, a small, dark shape moving impossibly fast, straight toward us. There was no time to react, no time to even process what was happening. It bolted directly into the fire. The sudden movement sent a shock through my system. For a split second, all I saw was the flicker of flames and the dark, writhing shape caught within them. Then came the sound, the horrible, unmistakable sizzling of flesh meeting fire. A shrill, agonizing screech filled the air, so sharp and unnatural that it sent shivers through my entire body. The smell followed almost immediately, a sickening mix of burnt fur and charred meat. It was a scent that clung to the inside of my nose, something I knew I would never be able to forget. Panic erupted. The fire flared as the creature thrashed, its tiny body convulsing in the heat. We were frozen, our screams mixing with the awful noise coming from the fire. The entire moment stretched on far longer than it should have, an eternity packed into mere seconds. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The body stopped moving. The sound faded, leaving behind only the crackle of burning wood and the lingering, acrid stench of death. No one spoke. We just stood there, staring at the fire, at the blackened remains curled up within it. It had been a mole, or at least it looked like one small, covered in soot and twisted in a way that made it hard to recognize. But why had it done that? Why had it run directly into the fire, straight into its own death? It made no sense. There was no logical reason for it, nothing in its natural instincts that should have led it to such a horrific end. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. Sleep was impossible. The fire burned a little longer than it should have, no one willing to get close enough to tend to it. Every sound in the woods felt amplified, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sending waves of tension through my already exhausted body. Even as the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon, the heaviness of what had happened still lingered in the air. When the sun was finally high enough to chase away the darkness, we forced ourselves to move. The fire had long since burned out, leaving only ashes and the charred remains of the mole. The sight of it in the daylight was worse somehow. Its tiny body curled up, blackened and broken. It didn't feel right to just leave it there, not after everything that had happened. So we buried it, a proper burial as proper as we could manage. We dug a small hole a short distance away from the campsite, somewhere where the earth was soft enough to work with. The smell still clung to the air, and as we placed the tiny body into the ground, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. Something about the whole thing felt wrong, like we had witnessed something we weren't supposed to, something unnatural, even though there was nothing supernatural about it. We covered the grave, marking it with a small pile of stones, and stood there for a long moment. There was nothing to say, nothing that would make sense of what had happened. We packed up camp quickly after that, the weight of the night still pressing down on us. As we left the site, I found myself glancing back one last time, my eyes lingering on the small pile of stones marking the mole's final resting place. The trip home was silent. Even as the miles stretched between us and the campsite, the feeling of unease never quite left. I kept replaying the moment in my mind, trying to understand why. Why had it done that? What had pushed that mole to run straight into the fire? Animals didn't behave like that. It should have turned, should have run in any other direction. But it hadn't. It had chosen that path, as if something unseen had been guiding it. I don't go camping as much anymore. Not because of fear, not exactly. It's more of a feeling, a deep, lingering sense of discomfort that never fully fades. That night stays with me, in the quiet moments, in the stillness of the dark. And sometimes, even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear it. The sound of burning flesh, the high-pitched screech of something meeting its end in the flames. It's a sound I know I'll never forget. Camping with my siblings had always been something we looked forward to. It was our way of escaping the world for a while, disconnecting from everything and just enjoying nature. We had done it plenty of times before, setting up tents by lakes, cooking over an open fire, and falling asleep to the sound of crickets and distant owls. But nothing could have prepared us for the storm that hit us that night. The day had been calm, warm, and pleasant. The lake stretched out in front of us, still and reflective, disturbed only by the occasional ripple of a fish breaking the surface. We had spent most of the afternoon swimming, fishing, and sitting around a small fire, roasting whatever snacks we had brought. There was no sign of what was coming. The sky had been clear, with only a few wisps of clouds here and there. If anything, it had been one of the better camping trips we'd had so far. But as the sun began to set, the wind started picking up. It wasn't much at first, just a cool breeze that rustled through the trees and made the lake ripple a little more than before. We didn't think much of it. We had checked the weather beforehand, and while there had been a small chance of rain, nothing seemed serious enough to worry about. Then, as darkness settled in, the temperature dropped noticeably. The wind grew stronger, and the air felt different, heavy, charged. The first distant rumbles of thunder reached our ears, deep and rolling, vibrating through the ground. We glanced at each other, but there was nothing to do except wait and see. We figured it would be a passing storm, a bit of rain, maybe some lightning, and then it would move on. We were very wrong. It started with the lightning. Flashes lit up the sky, illuminating the entire forest in bright white for split seconds before plunging everything back into darkness. The thunder, once distant, grew closer, each clap louder than the last. The wind howled through the trees, bending branches, sending leaves spiraling through the air. The lake, once calm, now had waves rolling across its surface, breaking violently against the shore. Then came the rain. It wasn't a light drizzle or even a steady downpour. It was a torrential, hammering force that pounded against our tent, making it feel like we were being attacked from all sides. The fabric shook, flapped, and lifted with every powerful gust of wind. The pegs holding the tent down strained against the force, and for a moment, we weren't sure if they'd hold. The storm was directly over us now, and the sky was alive with lightning, the flashes coming so frequently that it felt like a strobe light was going off. The thunder never stopped. It wasn't just individual claps anymore. It had turned into a continuous, earth-shaking roar. It was deafening, relentless, like something was tearing the sky apart. We could feel it in our chests, reverberating through our bones. The wind grew stronger, and then we felt it. Our tent started to lift. Panic hit immediately. There was no way the tent was going to last much longer. The stakes were already loosening, and we could feel the floor of the tent rising beneath us as if it was about to be ripped away. That was when we made the decision we had to get to the car. We grabbed whatever we could in the moment, unzipped the tent, and ran. The rain pelted us like bullets, the wind making it nearly impossible to stay upright. Lightning flashed every few seconds, lighting up the campground, revealing trees bending, branches snapping, and waves crashing violently against the shore. The ground was muddy and slick, making it difficult to run without slipping. By the time we reached the car, we were completely soaked. We threw the doors open, scrambled inside, and slammed them shut. For a moment, there was only the sound of our breathing, heavy and frantic, our hearts racing from the adrenaline. Then we looked out the window. Just as we had feared, our tent was gone. The wind had lifted it completely, sending it tumbling across the campsite before slamming it into a tree. The poles snapped, the fabric shredded. If we had stayed inside just a few moments longer, we would have been inside when it collapsed. But even in the car, we weren't safe. The wind rocked the vehicle violently, shaking it like it weighed nothing. It felt like something was trying to lift it off the ground. The rain was so heavy that we could barely see past the windshield. The endless roar of thunder and wind made it impossible to think clearly. That was when we made the next decision. We had to leave. Staying in the car was no safer than staying in the tent. We turned the key, threw the car into gear, and took off. The roads were slick, the rain making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Every flash of lightning revealed the trees swaying dangerously close to the road, some already leaning at unnatural angles. The wind pushed against the car, making it hard to keep straight, but we kept going, heading toward my grandpa's house about 20 minutes away. Those 20 minutes felt like an eternity. The storm followed us, lightning flashing, thunder booming, the wind howling through the trees on either side of the road. It wasn't until we finally pulled into the driveway, safe under the cover of his porch, that we could breathe again. The storm continued through the night, but we were safe inside. We didn't sleep much. Every time we closed our eyes, we could still hear the roar, feel the wind, see the lightning flashing behind our eyelids. The next morning, we made our way back to the campsite. The destruction was immediately clear. Trees had fallen, branches littered the ground, and parts of the campground were completely unrecognizable. A section had been closed off, and we soon found out why. A small tornado had passed through the campground the night before. We had been right in its path. We had no way of knowing if it had happened while we were there or after we had left, but the thought of how close we had been made our stomachs turn. If we had waited just a little longer before running to the car, if we had stayed in the tent just a little too long, if we had hesitated before leaving in the car, we could have been caught right in the middle of it. We spent the next couple of hours cleaning up what we could. Some of our gear was gone, either blown away or buried under debris. One thing I never found was my sleeping bag. I searched for it, walked up and down the campground, checked the trees, even looked near the lake, but it was gone. Maybe it had been carried away by the wind, or maybe it was buried under the wreckage of a fallen tree. Either way, it was never coming back. That storm was the most powerful, most terrifying thing I had ever witnessed. The sound of the wind, the roar of the thunder, the feeling of the car shaking under the force of the storm. Those things never really leave you. To this day, whenever I hear thunder rolling in the distance, I remember that night. The night we ran for our lives, not knowing if we were going to make it out. had planned this trip for a while. A few days alone in the valley, no cell service, no distractions. Just me, my truck, and the quiet of the woods. It was the kind of isolation I had been looking forward to, the kind that let you clear your mind and reset. The first day went as planned. I hiked a bit longer than I meant to and ended up coming back to the valley later than I expected. Just as the sun started to set, I ran into a local guy on the trail. He seemed friendly enough, knew the area well, and pointed me toward a good camping spot. Secluded but still close to the road and the river. He mentioned it was a place only locals really used, hidden well enough that most people wouldn't stumble across it. I found the spot easily. It was tucked away, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. The trees covered it well, and there was just enough clearing for a fire. I set up, started a fire, cracked open a beer, and let the night settle in around me. The sound of the river mixed with the crackling fire, and I put on my friend's comedy podcast, letting the familiar voices fill the space. It was peaceful, and after a while I started to feel at ease. I had planned to set up my tent, but by the time I was tired, it was already late, and I figured it wasn't worth the effort. The back of my truck was comfortable enough, especially under the topper. It felt safer too, more enclosed, more secure. I turned in, listening to the last bits of the podcast as I drifted off to sleep. I slept fine.
No extrangenoisis, no disturbances.
It wasn't until the morning that things felt off. I woke up early, started a fire again, and cracked another beer as I got my gear together for breakfast. The sun was just beginning to push through the trees, and everything had that crisp, fresh morning air. I was focused on getting my food together when I noticed something at the edge of my camp. A man. He stood just at the tree line, watching not directly at me, but in my direction. He looked like he had been out there for a long time. His beard was thick and unkempt. His clothes were covered in dirt, and what stood out most were the plastic grocery bags. Dozens of them, tied all over his clothing. They rustled softly as he moved. I tried to keep my tone light, mentioning how nice of a day it was. Nothing. I offered him breakfast. No response. He just paced, slowly, around the perimeter of my camp. His movements were strange, almost like he was waiting for something. The way he never looked directly at me set me on edge. It wasn't normal. I offered him a beer, just trying to gauge if he was even aware of me. Still nothing. He just turned around, standing with his back to me, shifting his weight from foot to foot. That was when I knew. This wasn't someone lost. This wasn't someone passing through. He had been watching me, maybe all night, maybe longer. I felt the weight of my bear spray and my buck knife at my side. I was close to my truck, but every second he stayed made the air feel heavier. The situation was shifting from strange to something worse. I gave him a choice, either acknowledge me or leave. Nothing. I took a step toward him, bear spray in hand, and that was when he moved. Not fast, not in a panic, but like he had just been waiting for the moment to go. He sulked away, the plastic bags tied to his clothes rustling as he stepped back into the woods. I watched until he was out of sight, but I knew he wasn't really gone. I didn't waste time. I threw my gear into the truck, not bothering to pack it neatly. I didn't eat. I didn't put out the fire properly. I just got in, started the engine, and got out of there. I don't know what he wanted. Maybe nothing. Maybe something worse. But I do know this, I wasn't supposed to see him. I wasn't supposed to know he was there. And that's what still unsettles me the most. I never went back to that valley. Never camped there again. I still go on solo trips, but I never make myself obvious anymore. No fires. No music. No unnecessary noise. I set up camp quietly and keep a low profile. Because out there, in places where no one can hear you, you never really know who's watching. I had planned this trip for a while. A few days alone in the valley, no cell service, no distractions. Just me, my truck, and the quiet of the woods. It was the kind of isolation I had been looking forward to, the kind that let you clear your mind and reset. The first day went as planned. I hiked a bit longer than I meant to and ended up coming back to the valley later than I expected. Just as the sun started to set, I ran into a local guy on the trail. He seemed friendly enough, knew the area well, and pointed me toward a good camping spot. Secluded but still close to the road and the river. He mentioned it was a place only locals really used, hidden well enough that most people wouldn't stumble across it. I found the spot easily. It was tucked away, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. The trees covered it well, and there was just enough clearing for a fire. I set up, started a fire, cracked open a beer, and let the night settle in around me. The sound of the river mixed with the crackling fire, and I put on my friend's comedy podcast, letting the familiar voices fill the space. It was peaceful, and after a while I started to feel at ease. I had planned to set up my tent, but by the time I was tired, it was already late, and I figured it wasn't worth the effort. The back of my truck was comfortable enough, especially under the topper. It felt safer too, more enclosed, more secure. I turned in, listening to the last bits of the podcast as I drifted off to sleep. I slept fine.
No estrange noises, no disturbances.
It wasn't until the morning that things felt off. I woke up early, started a fire again, and cracked another beer as I got my gear together for breakfast. The sun was just beginning to push through the trees, and everything had that crisp, fresh morning air. I was focused on getting my food together when I noticed something at the edge of my camp. A man. He stood just at the tree line, watching not directly at me, but in my direction. He looked like he had been out there for a long time. His beard was thick and unkempt. His clothes were covered in dirt, and what stood out most were the plastic grocery bags. Dozens of them, tied all over his clothing. They rustled softly as he moved. I tried to keep my tone light, mentioning how nice of a day it was. Nothing. I offered him breakfast. No response. He just paced, slowly, around the perimeter of my camp. His movements were strange, almost like he was waiting for something. The way he never looked directly at me set me on edge. It wasn't normal. I offered him a beer, just trying to gauge if he was even aware of me. Still nothing. He just turned around, standing with his back to me, shifting his weight from foot to foot. That was when I knew. This wasn't someone lost. This wasn't someone passing through. He had been watching me, maybe all night, maybe longer. I felt the weight of my bear spray and my buck knife at my side. I was close to my truck, but every second he stayed made the air feel heavier. The situation was shifting from strange to something worse. I gave him a choice, either acknowledge me or leave. Nothing. I took a step toward him, bear spray in hand, and that was when he moved. Not fast, not in a panic, but like he had just been waiting for the moment to go. He sulked away, the plastic bags tied to his clothes rustling as he stepped back into the woods. I watched until he was out of sight, but I knew he wasn't really gone. I didn't waste time. I threw my gear into the truck, not bothering to pack it neatly. I didn't eat. I didn't put out the fire properly. I just got in, started the engine, and got out of there. I don't know what he wanted. Maybe nothing. Maybe something worse. But I do know this, I wasn't supposed to see him. I wasn't supposed to know he was there. And that's what still unsettles me the most. I never went back to that valley. Never camped there again. I still go on solo trips, but I never make myself obvious anymore. No fires. No music. No unnecessary noise. I set up camp quietly and keep a low profile. Because out there, in places where no one can hear you, you never really know who's watching. About 10 years ago, I went camping at Ginny Springs in Florida. It was one of those trips that felt like a perfect getaway. Just me, my tent, and the quiet of nature. The area was beautiful, full of crystal clear springs and dense trees. It was popular, but it never felt too crowded. The first day went as expected. I set up my tent near the river, made a small fire, and just relaxed. The air was thick with humidity, and the scent of wet earth and burning wood mixed in the air. I spent the evening by the fire, watching the sky turn dark, listening to the soft rustling of the trees and the occasional distant laughter from other campsites. When I finally crawled into my tent, I expected nothing but a peaceful night. I was dozing off when I heard it. A loud, deep crack, then a groan, long and heavy, like something massive shifting in the dark. Before I could even process what it was, there was a deafening crash. The ground seemed to vibrate under me. It was a sound you only ever hear in movies. A tree falling, but not just any tree. A huge one. I laid there, frozen, listening. Everything had gone silent. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Just stillness. I told myself it was just a tree falling in the woods. It happens. It's nature. It was probably far away. Then, about 10 minutes later, I heard voices. Not just one or two, but a lot. Dozens, maybe more. The kind of frantic murmuring that sets off alarm bells in your head. I unzipped my tent and stepped out. People were gathering a little ways down from where I had set up. Flashlights flickered through the darkness, beams of light bouncing between the trees. I walked toward the commotion, still groggy, trying to shake off the sleep. Then I saw it. The tree had fallen on a tent. A massive oak. Its thick trunk sprawled across what had once been someone's sleeping space. The fabric of the tent was flattened, barely visible beneath the weight of the wood. People stood around, whispering, their faces pale in the glow of their lights. Someone was inside. It hit me like a punch to the stomach. I had heard it happen. I had been lying there in my tent, half asleep, while someone just a short distance away was crushed beneath a tree. My hands felt clammy. More people arrived. Someone must have called 911 because, not long after, we heard the distant thump of helicopter blades cutting through the night air. The sound grew louder, closer, until a search and rescue chopper hovered above, its spotlight cutting a bright hole in the darkness. Rescue workers arrived, pushing through the crowd with urgency. Some people had tried to lift the tree, but it was impossible. The thing was ancient, thick with decades of growth. They needed heavy equipment, something strong enough to move thousands of pounds of wood. But this wasn't a construction site. This was the middle of the woods. The waiting felt endless. The murmurs of the crowd swirled around me, but I barely heard them. I just stared at the tent. Someone had been inside, maybe asleep, maybe dreaming, when their entire world came crashing down. After what felt like an eternity, they finally got the tree lifted. A team of paramedics rushed forward. The crowd pressed in, watching. Then I saw the look on one of the paramedics' faces. It was too late. The helicopter had come to take them, but there was no saving them. They were gone before help had even arrived. I don't remember how long I stood there. At some point, people started to drift back to their campsites. The crowd thinned. The murmurs died down. Eventually, I went back to my own tent and sat in the dark, listening. The night felt different now, colder, heavier. I didn't sleep much. Every creak of the trees made me flinch. Every small gust of wind made my heart race. I kept thinking about how random it all was. How you could be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that was it. One moment you're just another camper in the woods, and the next, by morning, the campground was quiet again. People packed up and left early. The spot where the tree had fallen was empty now. The tent and rescue equipment all cleared away. But the ground still bore the scars, the crushed earth, the broken branches. A reminder that something terrible had happened there. I left that day and never went back to Ginny Springs. I still camp, but now I look at the trees differently. I check the ground, the roots, the way the branches sway in the wind. Because sometimes, the scariest things aren't the ones lurking in the dark. Sometimes it's the things we never think about, the things we assume are safe, until they're not. When I was about 14 or 15 years old, my family had a tradition of camping at a state park every summer. It was the kind of place that felt like home to me. Familiar trails, the smell of pine in the air, the distant crackle of other campers' fires at night. My best friend always came along, and every evening after dinner, we had our own little tradition. We called it the ritual. The ritual was simple. Once it got dark, we would walk deep into the woods with our flashlights off, relying only on our senses and memory to find our way. It started as a way to test ourselves, to see how well we knew the paths, but over time, it became something else. There was a thrill to it, that mix of adventure and unease that made every step feel just a little dangerous. That summer, we decided to push the ritual further. We had always stayed within a reasonable distance of the campground, close enough that we could hear the occasional burst of laughter from a distant campsite or see the faint glow of lanterns in the distance. But on this night, we wanted to go further, just to see how far we could go before we got truly lost. We picked a trail we hadn't explored much before, one that led away from the main camping area. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and loose leaves, and the trees grew thick on either side of us, swallowing what little moonlight filtered through the branches. We walked side by side, careful with our footing, our flashlights off. About half a mile in, we heard it, whispering. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe the distant voices of other campers carrying through the trees. But it wasn't coming from ahead of us. It was behind us. We both stopped. Neither of us spoke. We listened. The whispering was soft, just on the edge of hearing, like someone speaking under their breath. It wasn't words, not really, just a low, murmuring sound. We turned on our flashlights and spun around. The beams cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just trees, just silence. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe we had imagined it, but as we started walking again, the whispering returned. This time, it was closer. We stopped again. My pulse pounded in my ears. I swept my flashlight across the woods, searching for anything, any movement. The forest was still, too still. Felt like the whole place was holding its breath. Then we saw her. She was crawling on the ground, moving slow, her hands and knees pressing into the dirt. Her clothes were dark and covered in mud, blending into the forest floor. Her hair hung over her face in tangled strands. She whispered as she moved, her voice just loud enough to be heard but too soft to make out the words. I felt frozen. Something about the way she moved didn't seem right. It wasn't the kind of crawling you do when you've fallen or when you're hurt. It was deliberate, slow, like she was searching for something, or someone. Then she stopped. Her head lifted slightly, and she turned towards us. For a moment, everything in me screamed to run. But then she stood up. She swayed slightly, blinking against the brightness of our flashlights. That was when I noticed how unfocused her eyes were, how her movements seemed sluggish and uncoordinated. She muttered something, her voice slurred, and then I understood. She wasn't some creature from the woods, wasn't some ghostly figure lurking in the dark. She was just a person, and she was very, very lost. We watched as she took a few unsteady steps toward us. Her clothes were damp with sweat and dirt, her face smudged with mud. She looked exhausted, confused. I glanced at my friend, and without a word, we both understood what needed to be done. We motioned for her to follow us, and slowly, she did. We turned around and started making our way back toward the campground, this time with our flashlights on, keeping an eye on her as we walked. She didn't speak much, just mumbled now and then, mostly nonsense. When we finally reached the main camping area, she seemed to come back to herself a little. She looked around, recognition flickering in her eyes. We started checking the campsites, asking if anyone knew her. Eventually, we found her group. They were sitting around a fire, laughing, drinking. They hadn't even noticed she was gone. When we told them where we had found her, they barely reacted. One of them stood up, muttered something about her always wandering off, and helped her to a seat by the fire. No thanks, no concern, just casual indifference. We walked back to our own campsite in silence. I don't know what unsettled me more, the whispering in the woods, or the fact that if we hadn't gone that far into the trees that night, she might have been out there until morning, alone. After that, the ritual didn't seem as fun anymore. We never walked that deep into the woods again. Camping had always been my escape. I wasn't perfect at it, but over the years I had gotten better. It wasn't about proving anything. I just liked being out there, away from everything. The more I camped, the less I worried about things beyond my control. I had learned to let things go, not to stress about what others did. If someone wanted to tailgate me on the highway or weave in and out of traffic, that was their problem. I was just focused on the road ahead. That mindset carried over into camping. I didn't worry much about things I couldn't control. I kept my gear in good shape, paid attention to the weather, and followed basic safety rules. but I never thought too much about what might be out there in the woods. Until this trip, I had picked a remote spot in a national forest, miles away from any marked trails. The area was dense with trees, and the terrain was rough, but I liked it that way. I parked my truck along a dirt road, shouldered my pack, and hiked in about 6 miles before setting up camp near a small clearing. There was a creek nearby, plenty of dry wood for a fire, and no signs of other people. Perfect. The first day was uneventful. I gathered firewood, set up my tent, and cooked a simple meal as the sun dipped below the trees. The woods were quiet, aside from the usual sounds of nature. Felt peaceful. That night, I woke up to a noise outside my tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a small animal, but as I lay there listening, I realized it wasn't. It was movement, something slow, deliberate, and heavy. I stayed completely still, gripping the knife I kept beside my sleeping bag. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I could hear breathing. Deep, slow, not quite human, but not entirely animal either. My stomach tightened, then silence. I didn't sleep much after that. At first light, I unzipped my tent and stepped out cautiously. Nothing seemed out of place at first. Then I saw the tracks. Deep, wide prints in the dirt, circling my campsite. Not a bear, not a human, something else. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe my tired mind had exaggerated the sounds in the night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to stay one more night, but to be extra cautious. I spent the day gathering more firewood, making sure I had enough to keep a strong fire burning all night. As the sun went down, I sat by the fire, trying to enjoy the peace of the woods. But the feeling of being watched never left me. The usual nighttime sounds were there. Crickets, distant owls, but underneath it all, there was something else. Presence. Around midnight, I heard it again. The slow, heavy footsteps coming from the tree line. My fire cast long shadows, but I couldn't see anything beyond the flickering light. I gripped my rifle, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped. I waited, breathless. Then movement. A dark shape just at the edge of the trees. Too tall to be a bear. Too broad to be a person. It didn't move closer. It just stood there. I didn't sleep at all. I kept the fire going, staring into the darkness, listening. At some point, the thing moved away. I don't know when. I only realized it was gone when the birds started chirping with the dawn. I packed up as fast as I could, barely stopping to eat. I moved quickly, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. I felt watched the entire hike back. When I reached my truck, I threw my pack in and started the engine, my hands shaking. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I looked back once, just for a second, and there, standing at the tree line, was the shape, watching me. I don't camp alone anymore. I had always been comfortable in the woods. Growing up, I spent summers camping with my dad, learning how to fish, start fires, and navigate with just a map and compass. As I got older, solo camping became my escape from the stress of everyday life. I enjoyed the quiet, the self-sufficiency, the solitude. I had never been afraid to be alone in the forest until this trip. I picked a remote area in the mountains, about 6 miles from where I parked my truck. No marked trails led to where I was going, just game trails and old logging roads. I wanted complete isolation. I had done trips like this plenty of times before, and I was prepared. I packed light but smart tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, and my rifle just in case. You never know what kind of wildlife you might run into. The hike in was long and rough, mostly uphill. The forest was dense, but I moved at a steady pace. Around mid-afternoon, I found a clearing near a small stream, a perfect spot to set up camp. It was quiet, just the sound of running water and the occasional bird call. I pitched my tent, gathered wood for a fire, and settled in for the night. As the sun set, the woods took on that eerie stillness they sometimes get at dusk. I made a fire, cooked a meal, and sat back, listening to the sounds of the forest. Everything felt normal, peaceful, but something changed as the night went on. The usual nighttime noises, crickets, frogs, the distant hoot of an owl, started to fade. The silence grew heavier, more unnatural. I brushed it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But the uneasy feeling in my gut didn't go away. I went to sleep, but it didn't last long. I woke up to a noise outside my tent. It wasn't a small animal scurrying around. It was heavier, slower. My heart started pounding. I reached for my rifle, keeping still, listening. The sound moved around my campsite, circling. I held my breath, waiting. Then silence. I lay awake for hours, straining to hear anything, but nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off again. In the morning, I checked around my campsite. The ground was disturbed. Something had definitely been walking around during the night. The footprints weren't clear, but they were large. Too large for a deer. I told myself it was probably a bear and decided to be extra cautious. I spent the day exploring the area, staying close to camp, and making sure my firewood pile was stocked. I wasn't taking any chances. That night, it happened again. The same slow, deliberate footsteps moving just outside my tent. I gripped my rifle, my finger hovering near the trigger. The footsteps stopped, and then a strange sound. Something between a breath and a growl, deep and low. My skin crawled. Whatever it wasn't afraid of me. I stayed awake until dawn, my body tense, my mind racing. I had planned to stay another night, but I wasn't sticking around any longer. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my gear and started the hike back. I moved fast, barely stopping to catch my breath. The whole time I felt watched. Every few minutes, I heard something behind me. Branches snapping, footsteps matching my own pace. But every time I turned around, nothing was there. The last stretch of the hike was the worst. The forest felt tighter, like it was pressing in on me. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. Then, maybe a mile from my truck, I saw it, a shape just at the edge of the trees. Tall, dark, unmoving. I didn't stop to get a better look. I ran. I reached my truck, threw my pack in, and peeled out of there, my hands shaking. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know, but I haven't camped alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. I had been camping deep in the woods for years. I never stayed at campgrounds. I wanted real isolation, the kind where you don't hear cars, voices, or anything man-made. Just the sounds of nature, the rustling of trees, the occasional distant howl of a coyote. I liked it that way, but after my last trip, I don't know if I'll ever go back. I had planned a 3-day solo trip into an area of national forest I had never explored before. It was far from any main roads, deep enough that I wouldn't run into other hikers. I had done my research, studied the terrain, and packed everything I needed. I wasn't new to this. I always carried my rifle when I camped alone, more for peace of mind than anything else. Wild animals usually don't bother you, but you never know. The first day went smoothly. I hiked about 5 miles from where I parked my truck, following a game trail that led me to a small clearing near a creek. It was perfect. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and cooked dinner as the sun set. The forest was quiet, too quiet now that I think about it. Usually, as night falls, the woods come alive with sounds. Crickets, frogs, owls. But that night, there was nothing. Just an eerie, heavy silence. I figured it was just my imagination. I fell asleep easily, but something woke me in the middle of the night. A sound, distant at first, but growing closer. Heavy footsteps moving through the woods. Not a deer, not a bear. Something with weight. The steps were slow, deliberate, almost like they were pacing. I lay still in my sleeping bag, listening, gripping my knife in one hand, my rifle beside me. Then they stopped, right outside my tent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened. Whatever it was stood there for what felt like hours. I could hear deep, slow breathing, something big taking in air, exhaling in low, measured huffs. Then a sniffing sound, like it was smelling my tent, smelling me. Then the worst part, a low growl. Not a dog, not a wolf, Something deeper, rougher, almost like a human trying to imitate an animal. My blood turned to ice. I gripped my rifle tighter. If it tried to get inside, I would shoot. But it didn't. After what felt like an eternity, the thing took a few steps back. I heard it moving, circling my tent, then heading off into the woods. I lay there, still frozen, waiting for hours until the first light of dawn. When I finally unzipped my tent, my stomach dropped. The ground around my campsite was disturbed. Deep tracks in the dirt. Too big to be a wolf, too wide to be a bear. They looked almost like dog tracks, but elongated, misshapen. And then I saw the claw marks. Deep gouges in the trees, higher than I could reach. I packed up immediately. I was done. I had planned for 3 days, but I wasn't staying another night. I moved fast, barely stopping to eat, just pushing forward to get back to my truck before dark. The feeling of being watched never left me. Every few minutes, I would hear something. Branches snapping, heavy footsteps in the distance. But every time I stopped to listen, everything went silent. Then, maybe a mile from my truck, I saw it. I was moving through a clearing when I caught something in my peripheral vision. A figure standing just beyond the tree line. Tall, too tall, maybe 7 feet. Dark, matted fur. A head like a wolf but wrong. The snout too long. The ears too pointed. But the worst part was the eyes. They weren't animal eyes. They were intelligent, locked onto me, watching. I didn't move. Neither did it. We just stared at each other across the clearing, both waiting. Then it did something that still chills me to my core. It stood up, fully upright like a man. Its shoulders broad, its arms long, its hands. Yes, hands, not paws. Hung by its sides, claws curled slightly. And then it tilted its head, just slightly, as if studying me. I ran. I don't remember how I made it to my truck. I just remember the sound behind me. Heavy, fast footsteps matching my own. I didn't turn around. I just ran. I hit the dirt road, jumped into my truck, and tore out of there, heart slamming against my ribs. I don't know what I saw. I don't want to know. But I haven't been camping since. And I don't think I ever will. I had planned this camping trip for months. The idea was simple. A weekend alone in the woods, away from the noise of the city. No work emails, no buzzing notifications. Just me, my gear, and the quiet of nature. I picked a spot deep in a national forest, far from any designated campsites. I wanted real solitude, the kind where you don't see another human for days. I arrived late in the afternoon, parked my truck on a dirt road, and hiked about 3 miles in. The area was perfect. Dense trees, a small clearing for my tent, and a creek about 50 yards away for water. I set up camp methodically, laying out my gear, securing my food, and making sure everything was in place before darkness fell. I had done this before and knew the routine well. As the sun dipped below the treetops, the forest became quiet. The usual sounds of birds and insects faded, replaced by the occasional rustle of leaves. I made a small fire, cooked my dinner, and sat back, enjoying the peace. It felt good to be disconnected. That first night, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't an animal scurrying through the underbrush or the wind moving branches. It was a deliberate sound, something heavier moving through the woods. I listened, holding my breath, but after a few minutes, it stopped. Probably a deer, I told myself, though something about it felt off. The next day, I explored the area. I followed the creek for a while, found some animal tracks, mostly deer and raccoons, but something else caught my attention. Near the edge of a dense thicket, I found a set of footprints. They were human, but not fresh. Maybe a week old, maybe more. That wasn't strange in itself. Hikers pass through these woods sometimes, but these tracks led deeper into the forest, not towards any marked trails. I shrugged it off and continued exploring, eventually circling back to my camp. The day passed uneventfully, but as dusk settled, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The woods felt different, like they were holding their breath. That night, I woke up again. This time, I heard it clearly, footsteps. Not an animal, but the unmistakable sound of a person walking slowly. I lay still, my heart pounding. Whoever it was, they weren't using a flashlight. The steps moved around the edge of my campsite, deliberate, slow, as if someone was watching. Then silence. I stayed awake for a long time, gripping my knife, listening. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. In the morning, I checked the perimeter of my camp. I expected to find tracks, but saw nothing. The ground was undisturbed. No broken branches, no footprints. That didn't make sense. I knew what I heard. I debated packing up and leaving, but I had come all this way. I wasn't going to be scared off by some unexplained noises. Instead, I spent the day gathering firewood and making sure my camp was secure. As night fell, I made a larger fire, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. I forced myself to eat, though my stomach was tight with unease. I sat up for a long time, staring into the darkness, waiting. The footsteps returned, this time closer. I could hear twigs snapping underfoot. Someone was out there. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. The sound circled my camp, then stopped. I strained my ears, listening. Then the worst sound of all, silence. Suddenly, my fire flickered as if a breeze had passed through, though the air was still. I gripped my knife, every muscle tense. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed quickly, stuffing my gear into my backpack with shaking hands. As I turned to douse my fire, I saw it. Something hanging from a tree branch at the edge of my campsite. A piece of cloth, torn and weathered. It hadn't been there the day before. I didn't investigate. I just started walking, fast. I kept my knife in my hand the whole way back to my truck, every step feeling like something was just behind me. When I finally saw my truck, relief washed over me. I tossed my pack in, started the engine, and sped down the dirt road without looking back. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I do know one thing. I'll never camp alone again.